The silence that filled Mabel's saloon was broken only by the snap of cards on the worn oak table, as Katherine Calloway pulled her winnings toward her with a steady hand. In Sheridan, Wyoming, in 1885, it wasn't often that a woman beat 5 seasoned card players at their own game, but Katherine had been doing just that since she arrived 3 days ago, much to the growing resentment of the townspeople. "That's 3 hands in a row, Miss Calloway," drawled Timothy Walsh, the saloon owner, his gray mustache twitching with irritation. "Some might start to wonder about your streak of luck." Katherine met his suspicious gaze with unwavering blue eyes. "It's not luck, Mr. Walsh. It's skill. Something your establishment seems to be lacking." She tucked her winnings, nearly $30, into the small leather pouch at her waist and stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her practical navy traveling dress. Unlike the saloon girls with their bright silks and feathers, Katherine dressed plainly but well, her blonde hair pinned tightly beneath a modest hat. "We don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and taking money from honest folk," muttered Samuel Peters, a rancher who'd lost more than most to Katherine over the past days. "I wasn't aware that playing cards constituted theft," Katherine replied, her voice calm despite the tension thickening in the air. "The rules were clear, gentlemen. I simply played better." As she turned to leave, Timothy blocked her path. "Maybe you ought to move along, Miss Calloway. Sheridan's got enough card players. Don't need no female hustler taking business away from establishments that pay taxes and keep this town running." Katherine's spine stiffened. "I have every intention of setting up a legitimate business here, Mr. Walsh. I've already inquired about the vacant space next to the general store." A collective murmur spread through the saloon. The space in question had been empty for months, ever since old Ferguson's barber shop had closed down after his passing. "You can't be serious," Timothy sputtered. "A woman running a gambling hall. That's a perfectly sound business decision," Katherine finished for him. "Women can appreciate cards and spirits just as much as men, and I suspect the men might appreciate a change of scenery from." She glanced around at the dingy walls and sticky floors of Mabel's. The saloon door swung open, bringing with it a gust of October wind and the imposing figure of Keegan Zavala, trail dust still clinging to his denim and leather. His dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his sun-bronzed face. Unlike most of the men in the saloon, who were ranchers or townspeople, Keegan made his living driving cattle and breaking horses, a true cowboy who spent more time under the open sky than beneath a roof. He assessed the scene with keen hazel eyes, immediately sensing the hostility directed at the lone woman. It wasn't the first time he'd witnessed such a tableau in his travels throughout Wyoming territory, but something about the woman's dignified stance against the wall of masculine disapproval struck him. "Everything all right here?" Keegan's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "Just explaining to Miss Calloway that Sheridan doesn't need the kind of business she's proposing," Timothy said, puffing up his chest. "Town council won't approve it anyhow." Katherine raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware I needed the council's approval to rent a vacant building and operate a legal enterprise." "You do if you aim to serve liquor," Timothy countered. "And what respectable woman runs a card room?" "This one does," Katherine replied coolly. "And I'll go before your town council tomorrow if necessary." Keegan stepped forward, the spurs on his boots jingling softly against the wooden floor. "Seems to me the lady has as much right to try her hand at business as anyone else in this town." Timothy snorted. "What would you know about it, Zavala? You're hardly even part of Sheridan, just pass through whenever the mood strikes you." "I know enough about fairness," Keegan replied, his gaze shifting to Katherine. "And I know when someone's being treated unjustly." Katherine inclined her head in thanks, but maintained her composure. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Zavala, but I'm quite capable of handling this situation." "Never suggested otherwise, madam," Keegan said with the hint of a smile. "Just offering my support as one newcomer to another." Timothy pointed an accusatory finger at Katherine. "You mark my words, this town won't stand for competition from the likes of you. We've got standards here." "If your standards include watered-down whiskey and marked cards, then perhaps some competition would serve Sheridan well," Katherine retorted, causing several patrons to stifle laughs. Timothy's face reddened with fury. "Get out of my establishment. Now." Katherine gathered her small reticule and walked toward the door with dignified steps. As she passed Keegan, their eyes met briefly. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits navigating a world determined to keep them in their assigned places. Outside on Sheridan's Main Street, the October afternoon was giving way to evening. Katherine pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, bracing against the wind that swept down from the nearby Bighorn Mountains. She was calculating her next move when the saloon door opened behind her and Keegan Zavala emerged. "Miss Calloway," he called, approaching with long strides. "I hope you don't mind my following you out." Katherine regarded him cautiously. In her 26 years, she'd learned that men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. "What can I do for you, Mr. Zavala?" "Actually, I was thinking I might be able to help you," Keegan replied, stopping a respectful distance from her. "I heard you mention the old barber shop. I happen to know Ferguson's widow still owns that building, and she's been looking to sell, not just rent." Katherine's interest was piqued despite her wariness. "And how would you come by such information?" "I've done odd jobs for Mrs. Ferguson when I'm in town. Fixed her roof last spring after the heavy snowmelt damaged it." He tipped his hat back slightly, revealing more of his face in the fading light. "I could introduce you if you'd like." She doesn't care much for the town council's opinions, so Timothy's threats won't carry weight with her. Katherine studied him, trying to discern his motives. "That's very kind, but why would you help me?" "You don't know me." Keegan's expression grew thoughtful. "Let's just say I've seen how this town treats outsiders, especially those who don't fit their notion of what's proper. I've been on the receiving end myself, being half Mexican in a place that doesn't always take kindly to my kind." Katherine noticed for the first time the subtle hints of his heritage in his features, the high cheekbones, the warm undertone to his skin that wasn't entirely from the sun. She'd been too focused on her confrontation inside to really look at him before. "Besides," he continued with a slight grin, "anyone who can rile Timothy Walsh that effectively is someone I'd like to see succeed in Sheridan." Despite herself, Katherine felt a smile tugging at her lips. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Zavala. I would be grateful for an introduction to Mrs. Ferguson. Call me Keegan, please." He gestured down the street. "Mrs. Ferguson lives at the edge of town. I could take you there now if you're not otherwise engaged." Katherine hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Lead the way, Keegan, and you may call me Katherine." As they walked side by side down Sheridan's Main Street, neither could have predicted how their unlikely alliance would transform not only their lives, but the entire town. The Cowboy and the card sharp, two outsiders about to deal the town of Sheridan a hand it never saw coming. The walk to Mrs. Ferguson's modest home on the outskirts of Sheridan gave Katherine time to assess her unexpected ally. Keegan Zavala moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, despite the challenges his heritage must have presented in these parts. He didn't fill the silence with needless chatter, which Katherine appreciated after years of dealing with men who seemed allergic to quiet. "How long have you been in Sheridan?" she asked, as they passed the last cluster of buildings that marked the town proper. "On and off for about 5 years," Keegan replied, adjusting his stride to match her shorter one. "I work cattle drives most seasons, break horses for some of the bigger ranches in the area. Never quite settled here, but never quite left either." Katherine nodded, understanding the pull of transience. "And before Sheridan, Texas mostly. Born near San Antonio to a Mexican mother and an Irish father, learned to ride almost before I could walk." His expression softened at the memory. "Lost them both to fever when I was 16. Been making my own way since then." "I'm sorry about your parents," Katherine said softly. Keegan acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "What about you? What brings a woman like yourself to Wyoming territory alone?" Katherine chose her words carefully. "Opportunity. I've spent most of my life in St. Louis. My father taught me cards when I was young. He believed a woman should know how to support herself, should the need arise." She didn't mention how that need had indeed arisen when her father died, leaving her with gambling skills but few other practical options in a world that offered limited choices to women. "I came west because there are fewer established businesses here, more chances for someone unconventional to make their mark." "Unconventional," Keegan repeated with a hint of amusement. "That's one way to describe a female saloon owner." "I prefer gaming establishment to saloon," Katherine corrected primly. "I intend to run a respectable business, clean tables, fair games, quality spirits. A place where a person's money is valued regardless of their gender or background." Keegan studied her with newfound respect. "You've given this considerable thought." "I've had years to plan while dealing cards in establishments far less reputable than what I envision." They crested a small rise, and Katherine paused to look back at Sheridan spread out below them, lights beginning to twinkle in windows as dusk settled. "This town has potential. It's growing, situated near the railroad, with ranches and mining operations bringing steady business." "And you think they'll accept a woman running such an establishment?" Katherine's expression hardened slightly. "They don't have to accept it. They just have to patronize it. Once they see I run a fair house with better offerings than Maybelle's, their objections will fade. Money tends to overcome prejudice, in my experience." "You might be right about that," Keegan conceded, "though Timothy and his friends on the council won't make it easy for you." "I've never expected things to be easy, Mr. Zavala." They approached a neat white clapboard house with a well-tended garden now going dormant for the winter. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the warm glow of lamplight spilled from the windows. "This is it," Keegan said, opening the small gate for Katherine to pass through. He led her to the front door and knocked firmly. The door opened to reveal an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that belied her frail appearance. She peered at them through wire-rimmed spectacles. "Keegan Zavala," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Twice in 1 month. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Evening, Mrs. Ferguson. I've brought someone who might be interested in your late husband's shop. This is Miss Katherine Calloway." The old woman's keen gaze shifted to Katherine, assessing her with undisguised curiosity. "A woman interested in a barber shop, planning to cut hair, are you, Miss Calloway?" Katherine smiled politely. "No, madam. I'm looking to establish a gaming establishment, cards, primarily with a small bar." "I understand your husband's former shop is vacant." Instead of the shock or disapproval Katherine expected, Mrs. Ferguson's face crinkled into a smile. "Well, isn't that something? A female gambling parlor owner. Herbert would have found that quite amusing." She stepped back, opening the door wider. You'd better come in, both of you. I've just made tea, and you can tell me all about your plans while we decide if they are worth my time. Over the next hour, seated in Mrs. Ferguson's cozy parlor with delicate teacups that seemed at odds with the frontier town just down the hill, Katherine outlined her business proposal in detail. She explained her experience, her capital, carefully saved from years of card games, and her vision for transforming the modest barber shop into the Queen of Hearts, a refined establishment that would cater to both men and women seeking entertainment. Mrs. Ferguson listened intently, occasionally asking sharp questions that revealed her own business acumen. As the widow of one of Sheridan's earliest settlers, she clearly understood the town's dynamics better than most. "Timothy Walsh has been trying to buy that property from me for 2 years," she said when Katherine had finished. "Offers me half what it's worth, thinking I'm too old and addled to know the difference. Wants to expand Maybelle's, make it larger and even more vulgar than it already is." Her nose wrinkled in distaste. "I can offer you a fair price," Katherine said, naming a figure that made Keegan's eyebrows rise slightly. It was nearly all of her savings, but ownership would give her security that a rental agreement couldn't. Mrs. Ferguson set down her teacup decisively. "I'll accept that price, Miss Calloway, with one condition." "What condition would that be?" "That you promise to give Timothy Walsh conniptions with your success." The old woman's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Herbert never cared for him, and neither do I. The man's been acting like he owns this town since the moment he arrived." Katherine laughed, a genuine sound of delight that made Keegan look at her with new interest. It was the first time he'd seen her truly unguarded. "Mrs. Ferguson, nothing would give me greater pleasure." "Then we have an agreement." The elderly woman rose with surprising spryness. "I'll have the papers drawn up tomorrow. You can move in as soon as you wish." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Ferguson pulled Keegan aside briefly while Katherine adjusted her shawl. "You watch out for this one, Keegan," she murmured. "Timothy and his cronies won't take kindly to competition, especially from a woman. They play dirty when they feel threatened." Keegan nodded, his expression serious. "I know their kind. Don't worry, Mrs. Ferguson." Outside in the cool night air, Katherine was practically vibrating with excitement despite her composed exterior. "I can't believe it was that simple," she said as they began the walk back toward town. "One moment I'm being run out of a saloon, the next I'm a property owner." Mrs. Ferguson's approval carries weight in Sheridan, Keegan explained. "Her husband was one of the town's founders, but that doesn't mean your path forward will be easy." Katherine's steps slowed as she turned to face him. "Why are you helping me, really? And don't tell me it's just to irritate Timothy Walsh. There must be more to it than that." Keegan considered the question seriously, his face thoughtful in the moonlight. "I suppose I admire your courage. It takes a certain kind of strength to walk into a town alone and declare your intentions to change things, especially as a woman. It reminds me of something my mother used to say. The ones who don't fit in are often the ones who end up changing the world." Katherine was silent for a moment, touched by his words and the evident sincerity behind them. "Thank you," she said finally, "for the introduction to Mrs. Ferguson, and for standing up for me at the saloon." Keegan tipped his hat slightly. "My pleasure, Miss Calloway." "Katherine," she reminded him. "Katherine," he agreed, the name sounding somehow different in his voice, with its slight trace of a Texan drawl. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear Wyoming night. As they approached the town's modest hotel where Katherine was staying, Keegan spoke again. "That building will need work before it's ready for customers. The roof's sound, I made sure of that for Mrs. Ferguson, but the interior's been neglected. I could help with the renovations if you'd like. I'm handy with tools, and I'll be in town for at least the next month. The Patterson Ranch has hired me to break some new horses they've acquired. Katherine considered his offer. She'd planned to hire local men for the necessary work, but the hostility she'd encountered at Maybelle's suggested that might be more difficult than anticipated. And there was something about Keegan Zavala that inspired trust, a rarity in her experience. "I'd be grateful for your help," she said finally. "I can pay you a fair wage for your time." Keegan shook his head. "I don't need your money. The Pattersons pay well enough. Consider it an investment in seeing Timothy Walsh's face when a woman opens a better establishment right under his nose." Katherine smiled despite herself. "You really don't like him, do you?" "Let's just say I've seen how he treats people he considers beneath him," Keegan replied, his expression darkening momentarily. "But that's a story for another time." He gestured toward the hotel. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we can visit the building in daylight and make plans." As they reached the hotel entrance, Katherine extended her hand formally. "Thank you again, Keegan. It seems I've found an ally in Sheridan after all." Keegan took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. Instead of shaking it as she expected, he raised it briefly to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that should have seemed affected but somehow wasn't. "You found more than an ally, Katherine," he said quietly. "You found a partner." The word partner hung in the air between them, carrying possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. Katherine withdrew her hand slowly, her heart beating a little faster than it had been moments before. "Good night, Keegan." "Good night, Katherine. I'll meet you here at 8 tomorrow morning." As Katherine watched him walk away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness, she felt a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. In a single evening, her fortunes in Sheridan had shifted dramatically. She now had property, a clear path forward for her business, and an unexpected ally in a handsome cowboy who seemed to see her for who she truly was, not merely what society expected a woman to be. For the first time since arriving in Sheridan, Katherine allowed herself to believe that perhaps her gamble on this frontier town might pay off after all. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of cerulean sky that seemed unique to Wyoming. Katherine had risen early, too energized by the previous day's developments to sleep late. She dressed practically in a simple brown skirt and white shirtwaist, with sturdy boots suitable for inspecting a building that had stood empty for months. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simpler style than usual, acknowledging the day's work ahead. When she descended to the hotel's small lobby, Keegan was already waiting, hat in hand. He wore the same worn denim trousers as the day before, but his shirt was clean, and he'd trimmed his stubble to a more manageable shadow. Something about seeing him in the bright morning light made Katherine pause momentarily on the stairs. He cut an impressive figure, his broad shoulders and lean frame speaking to a life of physical work. Yet there was an undeniable gentleness in how he greeted the elderly desk clerk. "Good morning," Katherine said as she approached, pleased that her voice betrayed none of the unexpected flutter she felt at seeing him again. Keegan turned, and the smile that crossed his face seemed genuine. "Morning, Katherine. Ready to inspect your new property?" "More than ready." They stepped out into Sheridan's Main Street, already busy with morning activity. Several townspeople glanced their way with undisguised curiosity as they walked side by side toward the former barber shop. News traveled fast in small towns, and Katherine suspected that her confrontation at Maybelle's was already common knowledge. "People are staring," she noted quietly. "Let them," Keegan replied with a shrug. "They'll have plenty more to stare at once you open your establishment." The barber shop sat on a prime corner location, with large windows facing the street and a faded sign still proclaiming Ferguson's Tonsorial Parlor above the door. Keegan produced a key clearly entrusted to him by Mrs. Ferguson and unlocked the door, which creaked in protest. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through the grimy windows. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, with the main room opening into a second area in the back. The barber chairs had been removed, but several mirrors still hung on the walls, their surfaces clouded with dust. The wooden floor was solid but dull with neglect. Katherine walked slowly through the space, her mind already transforming it. "The front room will be perfect for tables," she said, gesturing. "The bar can go along that wall and the back room." She paused, considering. Private games, perhaps, for those who prefer a more exclusive setting. Keegan watched her, impressed by her clear vision. "It has potential," he agreed. "The structure's sound, mostly needs cleaning and some cosmetic work. New paint, polished floors." He ran a hand along the wall. "Mrs. Ferguson mentioned there's living quarters upstairs, though they're small." "I'll need to see those as well," Katherine said. "I've been calculating the cost of continued lodging at the hotel, and it would be far more practical to live above my business." They found a narrow staircase leading to a modest apartment consisting of a small parlor, an even smaller bedroom, and a rudimentary kitchen. The space was dusty but intact, with two windows that offered views of both the main street and the mountains beyond. "It's perfect," Katherine declared, already imagining how she would arrange her few possessions in the space. "Small, but all I need." Keegan nodded, though his expression held a hint of concern. "You'd be living alone above a business that's likely to attract a rough crowd at times. Have you considered the risks?" Katherine's chin lifted slightly. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Keegan. Besides, I'll have a shotgun and know how to use it. My father believed in practical education." This drew a smile from Keegan. "Somehow that doesn't surprise me." They spent the next hour making a detailed list of what would be needed to transform the space into the Queen of Hearts. Keegan proved knowledgeable about construction and materials. While Katherine had clear ideas about the aesthetics, she wanted to achieve elegant but not ostentatious, welcoming to both men and women, a cut above the usual frontier saloon. "I'll need to order furnishings from Denver," she mused as they finished their inspection. "Tables, chairs, a proper bar, that will take time to arrive." "The general store can order most of what you'll need for repairs," Keegan said. "Paint, varnish, new glass for those cracked window panes. I can start cleaning and preparing the walls while we wait for supplies." As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, locking the door behind them, Timothy Walsh emerged from Maybelle's saloon across the street. His face darkened when he spotted them, and he immediately crossed over, two of his regular patrons trailing behind him like faithful hounds. "Well, well," Timothy drawled, planting himself directly in their path. "Heard you've been busy, Miss Calloway. Seems old widow Ferguson has gone soft in the head, selling to the likes of you." Katherine met his gaze coolly. "Mrs. Ferguson appears perfectly sound of mind to me, Mr. Walsh. She simply recognizes a good business opportunity when she sees one." Timothy's gaze flickered to Keegan, his expression souring further. "And you, Zavala, throwing in your lot with her, thought you knew better than to get involved in town matters." "Just helping a new business owner get established," Keegan replied evenly. "Same as I'd do for anyone looking to make an honest living." Timothy snorted. "Honest? A woman running a gambling house. There's nothing honest about that. It's indecent is what it is." He leaned closer to Katherine, his breath sour with last night's whiskey. "Mark my words, Missy, the town council won't approve your liquor license. Not in a million years." Katherine didn't flinch. "I've already consulted the territorial statutes, Mr. Walsh. The council can't legally deny me a license if I meet all the requirements, which I fully intend to do. Discrimination based solely on gender would make for an interesting case for the territorial court." Timothy's face reddened at being outmaneuvered. "You think you're clever, don't you? But this is my town. These are my customers. You'll regret trying to take what's mine." Keegan stepped forward, his relaxed posture shifting subtly to something more alert, more dangerous. "That sounds an awful lot like a threat, Walsh." "Take it however you want, half-breed," Timothy spat, the slur deliberate and ugly. Katherine saw Keegan's jaw tighten, a muscle working in his cheek as he controlled his reaction. She placed a hand lightly on his arm, as much to restrain him as to show solidarity. "If you'll excuse us, Mr. Walsh, we have business to attend to," she said firmly. "I look forward to seeing you at the next council meeting, where I'll be presenting my application for all necessary licenses." She steered Keegan around the trio, maintaining her dignified pace until they had turned the corner toward the general store. Only then did she feel his arm relax slightly beneath her touch. "I apologize for involving you in this," Katherine said quietly. "It seems you're catching the brunt of his hostility by association." Keegan's expression was grim. "It's nothing I haven't heard before. And don't apologize, Walsh has been looking for reasons to run me out of town since I first arrived. You're just his newest excuse." Katherine studied his face, seeing the hurt beneath the stoic exterior. "It's wrong how he speaks to you. If it's any consolation, I suspect his days as the uncontested king of Sheridan's social life are numbered." This drew a reluctant smile from Keegan. "I believe you might be right about that." He glanced down at where her hand still rested on his arm, and Katherine withdrew it quickly, suddenly conscious of their public position. "Shall we continue to the general store? We have supplies to order," she said, professional once more. But as they walked side by side down Sheridan's boardwalk, both were acutely aware of a shift in their dynamic. A shared adversary had a way of forging stronger bonds than mere business association. Timothy Walsh's hostility had inadvertently pushed them closer together, creating an alliance that now felt somehow personal. By the time they reached the general store, the list of supplies in Katherine's neat handwriting had become not just a catalog of items needed for renovation, but the first page in a new chapter for both of them, one neither had anticipated when the sun rose that morning over the Wyoming frontier. Over the next 2 weeks, the Queen of Hearts began to take shape. Katherine had secured temporary accommodations at Mrs. Ferguson's home while the upstairs apartment was being renovated, an arrangement that proved beneficial beyond mere lodging. The elderly woman possessed a wealth of knowledge about Sheridan's history and politics, which she freely shared over evening meals. Katherine listened attentively, filing away information that might prove useful in navigating the town's social landscape. Meanwhile, Keegan worked tirelessly on the building when he wasn't fulfilling his obligations at the Patterson Ranch. He arrived early each morning, worked through the day, and often continued into the evening by lamplight. Under his skilled hands, the dusty, neglected space was gradually transformed. The floors were sanded and varnished to a warm honey glow, walls were repaired and painted a deep, rich green that Katherine had selected for its elegant atmosphere, and the bar salvaged from an abandoned ranch house outside of town was installed and polished to gleaming perfection. Katherine worked alongside him whenever possible, learning the practical skills of renovation that had never been part of her education in St. Louis. She proved a quick study, soon wielding a paintbrush with the same dexterity she applied to shuffling cards. Their easy partnership surprised them both. They moved around each other with a natural rhythm, anticipating needs and respecting boundaries without conscious effort. "You're getting quite proficient with that hammer," Keegan observed one afternoon as Katherine successfully hung a mirror behind what would soon be the bar. "Might have to hire you out as my assistant for future jobs." Katherine smiled, wiping a smudge of dust from her cheek. "I'm finding I rather enjoy creating something with my hands. It's satisfying in a way I hadn't expected." "It is," Keegan agreed, his gaze lingering on her longer than strictly necessary. The physical work had brought a healthy glow to her complexion and loosened tendrils of blonde hair around her face, softening her usual composed appearance. He found himself increasingly distracted by these small details. The sound of the front door opening interrupted the moment. They turned to find John Henderson, owner of Sheridan's general store, standing in the doorway with an uncomfortable expression. "Afternoon, Miss Calloway, Keegan," he greeted them, twisting his hat in his hands. "I have some news about your order." Katherine set down her tools, immediately alert to his tone. "Is there a problem, Mr. Henderson?" The storekeeper shifted his weight awkwardly. "I'm afraid I can't fill the rest of your order for building supplies, or any future orders for that matter." "Why not?" Keegan asked, stepping forward. "We paid in advance for those materials." Henderson couldn't quite meet their eyes. "I'll refund your money, of course. It's just, well, Timothy Walsh came to see me yesterday, reminded me how much business Maybelle's brings to my store. Said if I continued supplying you, he'd take his considerable custom elsewhere." Katherine's expression hardened. "So he's pressuring businesses not to work with me. I suspected as much when the lumber yard suddenly couldn't deliver our wood order." "I'm real sorry, Miss Calloway," Henderson said, genuinely regretful. "I can't afford to lose Walsh's business. He buys all his supplies from me, foodstuffs, liquor, everything for that saloon. It's nearly half my monthly income." Katherine nodded, understanding the man's position even as frustration coursed through her. "Thank you for having the courtesy to tell me in person, Mr. Henderson." After the storekeeper left, Katherine paced the half-finished room, her mind working furiously. "He's trying to starve us out before we even open. Without supplies, we can't complete the renovations." Keegan leaned against the bar, considering the problem. "We could order from Billings or even Cheyenne," he suggested. "It would cost more for shipping, but Walsh would likely find a way to interfere with that too," Katherine finished. "And we're running short on time. The town council meeting is in 2 weeks, and I need to have the place presentable enough to make my case for a liquor license." She stopped pacing suddenly, a determined glint in her eye. "What if we didn't need to buy supplies locally at all?" Keegan raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "The old Miller place," Katherine said. "Mrs. Ferguson mentioned it yesterday, an abandoned homestead about 5 miles out of town. The family left after last winter's blizzards. She said the house is still standing, though no one's bought the property." Understanding dawned on Keegan's face. "Salvage. We could take what we need from their lumber fixtures, maybe even furniture." "Exactly," Katherine nodded eagerly. "Is it possible? Could we do it?" Keegan considered the idea. "It's not stealing if the place is truly abandoned, and it's common practice out here to repurpose materials from deserted homesteads." He straightened up, decision made. "I'll ride out there tomorrow at first light to see what's available. If it looks promising, we can take my wagon the following day to haul back whatever we can use." Katherine's smile was radiant with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Keegan. I don't know what I would have done without your help these past weeks." Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Keegan took a half step toward her before catching himself. "Partners help each other," he said simply, echoing his words from that first night. The following day, Keegan confirmed that the Miller homestead was indeed abandoned and contained plenty of usable materials. The day after, Katherine joined him for the journey to the property, dressed in her most practical clothes and eager to contribute to the salvage effort. The ride out to the homestead took them through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush, the distant mountains a permanent backdrop to the vast Wyoming sky. Katherine found herself enjoying the open air and Keegan's quiet company. They talked easily as they traveled, sharing stories of their respective childhoods, hers in the bustling city of St. Louis, his on the Texas frontier. "My father was an inveterate gambler," Katherine explained as the wagon bumped along the rutted trail. "Not always a successful one, mind you, but he loved the mathematics of it, the probabilities, the strategies. He taught me everything he knew, said a woman needed a way to support herself in a world that wouldn't always be kind." "Wise man," Keegan commented. Katherine's expression softened with memory. "He was. He'd have liked you, I think. He always said character mattered more than circumstance." Keegan glanced at her, touched by the casual acceptance implied in her words. Few people in Sheridan would so easily suggest he might be worthy of their family's approval. "What about your mother?" he asked. "Died when I was 12. Consumption." Katherine's tone was matter of fact, but Keegan recognized the familiar shape of old grief. "She was a schoolteacher before she married. Insisted I receive a proper education, even as she worried about my father's influence on my moral character." A smile played at her lips. "She'd be horrified to know I've chosen to open a gambling establishment." "Or proud that you're building something of your own," Keegan suggested. Katherine considered this. Perhaps. She was more unconventional than she let on, had to be to marry my father. She turned the conversation away from herself. "What of your parents?" "You mentioned they died when you were young." Keegan nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "My father came to Texas looking for opportunity after the war, met my mother in San Antonio. She was working at her uncle's cantina." A fond smile crossed his face. "She was fierce, wouldn't marry him until he learned Spanish properly. Said no son of hers would grow up unable to speak his mother's language." "She sounds remarkable." "She was. Taught me to be proud of both sides of my heritage, even when others saw only the Mexican half and judged accordingly." His expression clouded. "After the fever took them, I worked cattle drives, learned to break horses. It was a way to make a living that didn't depend on others' opinions of me." They fell into comfortable silence as the homestead came into view, a simple structure of weathered wood standing solitary against the landscape, abandoned but still dignified in its emptiness. The day proved productive beyond their hopes. The Miller place yielded treasures that would have cost significantly more to purchase new. Solid oak floorboards from the main room that could replace the damaged sections in the back of Katherine's building, window frames in good condition, a large mirror with only a small crack in one corner, iron hinges and doorknobs, and even a set of sturdy chairs that needed only minor repairs. As they worked side by side, dismantling what could be salvaged, Katherine found herself watching Keegan when he wasn't looking. There was something compelling about the sure, economical way he moved, the respect with which he treated even an abandoned home. He worked without complaint through the heat of the day, pausing only when he insisted Katherine take breaks to rest and drink water from the canteen they shared. By late afternoon, the wagon was loaded with their salvaged materials, and they were both exhausted but satisfied with their haul. "We should head back," Keegan said, glancing at the sun's position. "I don't want to be on these roads after dark." As they prepared to leave, Katherine paused at the homestead's door, looking back at the now emptier house. I wonder what happened to them, the family who lived here. Mrs. Ferguson said they headed back east after the winter proved too harsh, Keegan replied, coming to stand beside her. Some people aren't made for frontier life. And some discover they're stronger than they knew, Katherine said quietly. Their eyes met, and Katherine became suddenly, acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the height difference between them, of the way the late afternoon sun caught golden highlights in his dark hair. For a breathless moment she thought he might lean down, might close the small distance between them. Instead, Keegan cleared his throat and stepped back. We should go. Storm clouds gathering to the west. The ride back to Sheridan was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts as they navigated the growing tension between them, not an uncomfortable tension, but the increasingly undeniable awareness of mutual attraction that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. As they approached town, the first fat raindrops began to fall, and by the time they reached the former barber shop, the gentle shower had become a steady downpour. They worked quickly to unload the wagon under the building's small awning, both getting soaked in the process. Finally, the last of the salvaged materials was safely inside, and they stood dripping in the main room, rain drumming on the roof above them. Katherine's practical blouse clung to her form, her hair falling in damp waves where it had escaped its pins. Keegan wasn't in much better condition, his shirt plastered to his chest, water running in rivulets from his dark hair down his face. They looked at each other and simultaneously burst into laughter, a release of the day's tension, of the success of their mission in spite of Timothy Walsh's attempts to thwart them, of the sheer ridiculousness of their bedraggled appearance. "We did it," Katherine said when their laughter subsided, her eyes bright with triumph. "Walsh thought he could stop us, but he underestimated what we could accomplish together." "He underestimated you," Keegan corrected, his expression warm with admiration. "I've never met anyone so determined." "Or so stubborn," Katherine suggested with a smile. "That too," Keegan agreed, returning her smile. The rain continued to pour outside, creating a cocoon of privacy around them in the half-renovated building. The atmosphere between them shifted, the laughter fading into something more intense, more expectant. Keegan took a step toward her, then hesitated. "Katherine," whatever he meant to say was interrupted by a loud knock at the front door. They both startled, the moment broken. Katherine moved to answer it, finding Mrs. Ferguson standing under a large black umbrella, concern etched on her wrinkled face. "Thank heavens you're both back," the elderly woman said, stepping inside. "I was worried when the storm hit, knowing you were out at the Miller place." She looked between them, noting their soaked clothing and the lingering tension in the air. A knowing expression crossed her face. "I see you made it back safely, and with supplies by the look of things." "Yes," Katherine confirmed, trying to collect herself. "It was a successful expedition." "Excellent," Mrs. Ferguson nodded approvingly. "Now, you'd both better come back to my house and dry off before you catch your deaths. I've stew simmering for dinner." As they gathered their things to leave, Katherine caught Keegan's eye once more. Whatever had almost happened between them remained unspoken, but the awareness of it lingered, a current of possibility running beneath the surface of their partnership. That night, as she lay in the guest bed at Mrs. Ferguson's house listening to the rain against the windows, Katherine found herself thinking not of the salvaged materials or the renovations still to be completed, but of the look in Keegan's eyes just before they were interrupted, a look that suggested their partnership might be evolving into something neither had anticipated when they first met in Maybelle's saloon barely 2 weeks ago. The day of the town council meeting arrived with clear skies, and a tension that seemed to permeate Sheridan like an approaching thunderstorm. Over the past days, Katherine and Keegan had worked feverishly to complete enough renovations to make the Queen of Hearts presentable for inspection. The salvaged materials from the Miller homestead had proven invaluable, allowing them to finish the main room and bar area to a standard that even exceeded Katherine's hopes. Word had spread throughout the town about the new establishment, dividing Sheridan's population into those curious enough to anticipate its opening, and those loyal to Timothy Walsh, who viewed it as an affront to the existing order. The polarization had grown more pronounced as the council meeting approached, with whispered conversations ceasing when Katherine entered shops and pointed stares following her down the boardwalk. On the morning of the meeting, Katherine dressed with particular care in her finest dress, a deep blue that complemented her eyes, with tasteful lace at the collar and cuffs. She arranged her blonde hair in an elegant but modest style, aiming to project both respectability and determination. Her goal was to present herself as a serious businesswoman, not the female interloper Walsh had been painting her as in his whisper campaign around town. When she emerged from Mrs. Ferguson's guest room, the elderly woman was waiting in the parlor, dressed in her Sunday best. "You look ready for battle, my dear," Mrs. Ferguson observed with approval. "I feel as though I'm preparing for one," Katherine admitted, checking the small reticule that contained all her business documentation. "That's precisely what it is," the older woman agreed. "A battle for your right to exist in a world designed for men." She handed Katherine a small, worn silver brooch in the shape of a heart. "This was my mother's. She wore it when she testified before the territorial legislature for women's property rights back in '69. Seems fitting you should wear it today." Touched, Katherine carefully pinned the brooch to her collar. "Thank you. This means a great deal to me." A knock at the door announced Keegan's arrival. He too had dressed for the occasion in clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a new vest, his dark hair neatly combed, his usually stubbled jaw clean-shaven. The effect was striking. The rough-edged cowboy transformed into a handsome, respectable gentleman who would not look out of place in any Eastern parlor. His eyes widened appreciatively at the sight of Katherine. "You look—" He seemed to search for an appropriate word before settling on. "Formidable." Katherine laughed, tension easing from her shoulders. "That may be the finest compliment I've received given the circumstances." They walked together to the town hall, a modest building at the center of Sheridan that served multiple civic functions. Already a crowd had gathered outside, far larger than the usual attendance for council meetings, according to Mrs. Ferguson's whispered explanation. Katherine recognized faces from various shops and businesses, as well as ranchers from the surrounding area who rarely came to town except for supplies or entertainment. Timothy Walsh stood on the steps, surrounded by his usual coterie of supporters, his florid face set in smug lines as he held court. His expression soured visibly when he spotted Katherine approaching with Keegan and Mrs. Ferguson. "Quite a turnout," Katherine murmured. "News travels fast in small towns," Keegan replied, his hand moving instinctively to her elbow as they navigated through the crowd. "Everyone wants to witness the confrontation." The meeting was held in the town hall's main room, with the 5 council members seated at a long table at the front. Mayor William Hargrove, a portly man with an impressive walrus mustache, called the meeting to order with a bang of his gavel, silencing the murmuring crowd that filled every available seat and standing space along the walls. "First item of business," the mayor announced, consulting a paper before him. "Application for a business and liquor license for an establishment to be called the Queen of Hearts, submitted by Miss Katherine Calloway." He peered over his spectacles at Katherine. "Miss Calloway, please step forward." Katherine rose from her seat in the front row, moving to stand before the council with calm dignity. Beside her, she sensed rather than saw Keegan's supportive presence as he stood slightly behind her right shoulder. "Gentlemen of the council," she began in a clear voice that carried throughout the room, "I am requesting approval for a gaming establishment and accompanying liquor license for the Queen of Hearts, located in the former Ferguson Barber Shop on Main Street, which I have purchased from Mrs. Eliza Ferguson." She proceeded to outline her business plan in concise, professional terms, explaining her experience, her vision for a respectable establishment that would cater to both men and women, and the economic benefit to Sheridan in terms of taxes, employment opportunities, and increased visitors from surrounding areas. "The renovations are nearly complete," she concluded. "I invite any council members to inspect the premises at their convenience before rendering a decision." Mayor Hargrove nodded, seeming impressed by her presentation despite himself. "Thank you, Miss Calloway." "Council members, do you have questions before we open to public comment?" Councilman James Peters, the owner of Sheridan's small bank, leaned forward. "Miss Calloway, while your business acumen is evident, I must ask, is it appropriate for a woman to run such an establishment? The serving of alcohol, the late hours, the types of clientele that gambling attracts, these are hardly suitable concerns for a lady." Katherine had anticipated this line of questioning. "Mr. Peters, I understand your concern, but I would point out that women already work in similar environments throughout the West as barmaids, entertainers, and even madams of less reputable establishments than what I propose." A murmur ran through the crowd at her frank reference. "The difference is that I will be the owner, not an employee, and I intend to run a respectable business where proper behavior is expected from all patrons." Another councilman, Henry Davis, the town's only doctor, spoke next. "What assurances can you provide that your establishment won't become a haven for unsavory elements? Sheridan has worked hard to develop a reputation as a family-friendly community." Katherine resisted the urge to glance pointedly at Maybelle's saloon, where brawls and dubious activities were common occurrences. "I will personally oversee all operations and maintain strict standards of conduct. Any patron who behaves inappropriately will be permanently banned. Additionally, I intend to hire local men as security to ensure order is maintained at all times." The questions continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Katherine responding calmly and competently to each concern raised. Throughout, Keegan remained a silent, supportive presence at her back, his very stance conveying solidarity. Finally, Mayor Hargrove opened the floor for public comment. Those wishing to speak for or against Miss Calloway's application may now come forward. Timothy Walsh was on his feet immediately, striding to the front of the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his opinions valued. "Mayor, councilmen, citizens of Sheridan," he began pompously, "I must strongly object to this application on moral and economic grounds." He launched into a lengthy diatribe about the corrupting influence of having a woman run a gambling establishment, the potential damage to Sheridan's reputation, and the unfair competition to existing, respectable businesses, such as his own Maybelle's saloon. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice rising dramatically, "I have reason to believe Miss Calloway's past activities may not bear close scrutiny. A woman traveling alone, making her living through gambling, one must question the propriety of such a lifestyle." The insinuation hung in the air, ugly in its implication. Katherine felt her cheeks burn with anger, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "I'd like to speak." All heads turned as Keegan stepped forward, his expression composed but determined. Katherine had not expected him to address the council, knowing how he typically avoided town politics and public attention. Mayor Hargrove looked surprised but nodded. "Mr. Zavala, you have the floor." Keegan moved to stand beside Katherine, his tall figure commanding attention despite his usual reticence. "I've worked alongside Miss Calloway these past weeks, helping renovate her building. I've seen firsthand her work ethic, her attention to detail, and her vision for a business that would be an asset to Sheridan." His voice, usually quiet, carried authority now. "As for Mr. Walsh's concerns about competition, isn't that the foundation of business in this country? The freedom to establish an enterprise, to succeed or fail based on one's own merit rather than the protection of those already in power." He looked directly at Timothy. "Unless you're suggesting that Maybelle's couldn't withstand fair competition from a better-run establishment." Timothy's face flushed with anger. "This isn't about competition. It's about decency. A woman has no business, if I may." Another voice interrupted, and Mrs. Ferguson rose from her seat, her diminutive figure somehow imposing as she moved to join Katherine and Keegan at the front. "I've known most of you since you were in short pants," she addressed the council, earning a few reluctant smiles. "And I've watched Sheridan grow from a dusty outpost to the town it is today." She gestured toward Katherine. "This young woman represents the future of our town, new blood, new ideas, the kind of enterprise that will help Sheridan thrive. My Herbert always said a town that stops growing starts dying." Her sharp gaze fixed on Timothy Walsh. "And growth requires competition, not monopoly." A murmur of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd. Emboldened, others began to stand and speak in favor of Katherine's application. The owner of the dress shop, who looked forward to catering to a female clientele with money to spend. A rancher who welcomed an alternative to Maybelle's, watered-down whiskey and crooked games. Even the school teacher who suggested that seeing a woman succeed in business would provide an inspiring example for her female students. Not all voices were supportive, of course. Several of Walsh's cronies echoed his concerns about propriety and morality, and the minister predictably objected to any new establishment serving alcohol and offering gambling, regardless of who owned it. Throughout the debate, Katherine stood tall, her expression revealing nothing of her inner tension. Beside her, Keegan remained a steadfast presence, his hand occasionally brushing against hers when the comments grew particularly cutting, a subtle gesture of support that meant more than she could express. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of discussion, Mayor Hargrove called for order. "The council will now deliberate and vote on Miss Calloway's application," he announced. "We'll take a brief recess and reconvene in 30 minutes. As the council members filed out to a private room, the crowd broke into animated conversation. Katherine, Keegan, and Mrs. Ferguson moved to a quiet corner of the hall. "You were magnificent," Mrs. Ferguson told Katherine, patting her hand. "Clear-headed, articulate. You gave them no legitimate reason to deny your application." "That doesn't mean they won't find an illegitimate one," Katherine replied, the strain of the proceedings finally showing in her voice. "Walsh has considerable influence." "But he doesn't have the final say," Keegan reminded her. "And you've made an impression on this town today, regardless of the outcome." Katherine looked up at him, touched by his unwavering support. "Thank you for speaking. I know how you feel about town politics." "Some things are worth the discomfort," he said simply, his gaze holding hers. The 30 minutes stretched into 45 before the council members returned, their expressions giving no hint of their decision. The room quickly fell silent as Mayor Hargrove took his seat and called the meeting back to order. After careful consideration of Miss Calloway's application and the public testimony offered today, the council has reached a decision, he announced formally. By a vote of 3-2, the application for business and liquor licenses for the Queen of Hearts is approved with conditions. A collective gasp went up from the crowd, followed immediately by a babble of voices, exclamations of surprise, muttered objections, and scattered applause. Timothy Walsh's outraged, "This is an outrage," was clearly audible above the general din. Mayor Hargrove banged his gavel for silence. The conditions are as follows. First, the establishment must close by midnight on weekdays and 1 o'clock on Saturdays. Second, the town marshal will conduct regular inspections to ensure compliance with all territorial laws regarding gambling and liquor sales. Third, Miss Calloway must hire at least one male security guard to be present whenever the establishment is open. He peered at Katherine over his spectacles. "Do you accept these conditions, Miss Calloway?" Katherine stepped forward, her heart racing with the unexpected victory. "I do, Mayor Hargrove, and I thank the council for their fair consideration." As the meeting formally adjourned, the crowd surged around them. Timothy Walsh pushed his way through, his face mottled with fury as he confronted Katherine. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You may have charmed the council, but the decent people of this town won't patronize your establishment. I'll make sure of that." Before Katherine could respond, Keegan moved between them, his stance protective but not aggressive. "I think you've said enough for one day, Walsh. The council has spoken." Walsh's gaze shifted to Keegan, hatred plain in his expression. "You'll regret taking her side, Zavala. Both of you will." With that parting threat, he stormed out, his supporters trailing in his wake like vultures denied a meal. Others from the crowd approached to offer congratulations, cautious from some, genuinely enthusiastic from others. Mrs. Ferguson beamed with pride as though Katherine were her own granddaughter, accepting congratulations from her contemporaries with gracious nods. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Katherine found herself standing on the town hall steps with Keegan beside her, both still absorbing the reality of the council's decision. "We did it," she said, wonder in her voice. "I can hardly believe it." "You did it," Keegan corrected gently. "This was your victory, Katherine." She turned to face him, emotion making her voice unsteady. "Not mine alone. Without your help with the renovations, your support today." She shook her head. "I couldn't have done this without you, Keegan." Their eyes met, and the connection between them seemed to strengthen, to crystallize into something neither could continue to deny. Around them, Sheridan continued about its business, wagons rolling past, shoppers moving along the boardwalk, life proceeding as normal. But for Katherine and Keegan, something fundamental had shifted. "What happens now?" Keegan asked quietly. Katherine smiled, her blue eyes bright with triumph and possibility. "Now we finish the renovations and open the Queen of Hearts, and then—" She took a deep breath. "Then we see what happens next." The unspoken question lingered between them whether "we" referred only to their business partnership or to something more personal, more profound that was taking root between them, nurtured by shared purpose and mutual respect. Neither was quite ready to define it, but neither could deny its existence. As they walked side by side back toward what would soon be the Queen of Hearts, Katherine knew that whatever challenges Timothy Walsh might still pose, whatever obstacles lay ahead in establishing her business, she was no longer facing them alone. In Keegan Zavala, she had found not just a business partner but a true ally and perhaps, if she dared to hope, something even more meaningful in this frontier town that was gradually, reluctantly beginning to accept her presence. The grand opening of the Queen of Hearts was scheduled for the first Saturday in November. giving Katherine and Keegan just over a week to complete the final preparations. The days following the council meeting passed in a blur of activity as they worked to transform their vision into reality. Word of Katherine's victory spread quickly throughout Sheridan and even to neighboring communities. The controversy had served as unexpected advertising, generating curiosity that promised a sizable crowd for the opening night. Katherine received her official licenses, framed them prominently behind the bar, and placed her first orders for liquor and supplies from a distributor in Cheyenne, who was beyond Timothy Walsh's influence. Mrs. Ferguson introduced Katherine to Mabel Thompson, a widow in her 40s who had worked as a cook at her ranch until recently and was looking for new employment. Katherine immediately hired her to prepare food for the Queen of Hearts' simple but satisfying fare that would complement the drinks and keep patrons lingering at the gaming tables. For security, Katherine hired 2 of the Patterson ranch hands recommended by Keegan brothers named Jim and Tom Larson, who were imposing in size, but even tempered and respectful. They would work alternate nights, ensuring that the establishment always had protection without straining Katherine's initial budget. The day before the opening, Katherine stood in the center of the main room, taking in the transformation with pride and a touch of astonishment. The scarred pine bar gleamed with multiple coats of varnish, its brass foot rail polished to a mirror shine. 6 gaming tables were arranged strategically around the room, each covered in green baize that Katherine had painstakingly stretched and tacked herself. The salvaged chairs had been repaired, sanded, and stained to match, creating a cohesive look despite their varied origins. The walls, painted the deep green she'd envisioned, were adorned with mirrors and tasteful artwork landscapes of Wyoming that Mrs. Ferguson had contributed from her own collection. Oil lamps with polished reflectors were positioned to provide the best possible light without glare, and brass spittoons were discreetly placed to encourage proper behavior from those who chewed tobacco. The back room had been transformed into a more private gaming area with 2 additional tables and comfortable chairs, ideal for those who preferred a quieter setting or higher stakes games. A small office adjoined this room, where Katherine could manage the accounts and store the day's takings securely. Upstairs, the apartment had been thoroughly cleaned and modestly furnished with pieces Katherine had purchased from various townspeople, a practical arrangement that served the dual purpose of making her living quarters comfortable and integrating her further into the community by conducting business with local families. "It's perfect," came Keegan's voice from behind her, startling Katherine from her reverie. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, a wooden crate in his arms. His usually reserved expression was open with admiration for the transformed space, or for her. Katherine wasn't entirely sure. "I think it might be," she agreed, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "I can hardly believe we did all this in less than a month." Keegan set the crate on the bar and began unpacking bottles of whiskey, arranging them on the shelves they'd built behind the counter. "You knew exactly what you wanted, made it easier to bring your vision to life." Katherine moved to help him, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked side by side. These small, incidental touches had become more frequent in recent days, neither of them acknowledging the slight catch of breath each contact provoked. "What do you think Timothy Walsh will do?" Katherine asked, voicing the concern that had lingered at the back of her mind throughout the preparations. "He made it clear he wouldn't accept defeat graciously." Keegan's expression grew serious. "He'll try to undermine you, certainly. Might pressure people not to patronize your establishment, spread rumors, that sort of thing." "I can handle rumors," Katherine said confidently. Once people see for themselves what the Queen of Hearts offers, Walsh's words will hold less power. Just be careful, Keegan cautioned. Men like Walsh don't like being bested, especially by a woman, and he clearly holds a grudge against me as well. Katherine studied his profile as he arranged the bottles with careful precision. Why does he dislike you so much? It seems to go beyond the usual prejudice. Keegan was silent for a moment, considering how much to share. 2 years ago, I caught him cheating at cards in Maybelle's, he finally said. Called him out publicly. He tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, but enough people saw what happened to know the truth. That would explain his animosity, Katherine mused. There's more, Keegan continued, his voice lower. Later that night, I found one of the saloon girls Lily behind the building. Walsh had beaten her for speaking up about his cheating. I stepped in, might have broken his nose in the process. His jaw tightened at the memory. Lily left town the next day. Walsh has had it in for me ever since. Katherine's hand moved instinctively to cover his where it rested on the bar. You did the right thing. Keegan turned his hand to clasp hers, the gesture more deliberate than their previous casual touches. Walsh has influence in this town. The kind that comes from having money and not caring who you hurt to keep it. Don't underestimate him, Katherine. The genuine concern in his eyes touched her deeply. I won't, she promised, but I won't let him intimidate me either. They remained that way for a long moment, hands joined on the polished bar surface, the connection between them strengthening in the quiet of the nearly completed establishment. Finally, Keegan gently withdrew his hand and reached into his vest pocket. I brought you something, for tomorrow night. He produced a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Katherine accepted it with curious fingers, carefully undoing the string to reveal a delicate silver pin in the shape of a playing card, the Queen of Hearts, intricately detailed with tiny rubies forming the heart symbols. Keegan, she breathed, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. It's beautiful. Seemed fitting for the proprietress of the Queen of Hearts to have her emblem, he said, a slight flush coloring his cheekbones beneath his tan. I had it made by the silversmith in Billings when I went to collect the liquor order. Katherine pinned it to her blouse immediately, the silver catching the afternoon light streaming through the newly cleaned windows. Thank you. I'll wear it tomorrow night and every day thereafter. Their eyes met again, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings that had been building steadily throughout their weeks of working together. Keegan took a half step closer, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips. The moment was interrupted by the front door opening as Mabel Thompson arrived with baskets of food preparations for the following evening. Katherine and Keegan moved apart, the spell broken but not forgotten as they returned to the practical tasks of preparing for the grand opening. That evening, Katherine sat at the small desk in her new apartment, finalizing the ledger system she would use to track the business's finances. The building was quiet, the workmen and helpers all gone home, leaving her alone with her thoughts and anticipations for the following day. A soft knock at the downstairs door caught her attention. Cautious by nature, Katherine retrieved the shotgun from beside her bed before descending the stairs, though she suspected who her visitor might be. She was right. Keegan stood on the boardwalk, hat in hand, expression uncharacteristically uncertain. I apologize for the late hour, he said as she opened the door, his eyes noting the shotgun with approval rather than offense. I wanted to make sure everything was secure for the night. That's thoughtful of you, Katherine said, setting the shotgun aside and stepping back to allow him entry. Would you like to come up for coffee? I was just finishing some paperwork. Upstairs, in the small but cozy apartment, Katherine busied herself with the coffee pot while Keegan stood somewhat awkwardly near the window, looking out at Sheridan's quiet Main Street. "Hard to believe it's really happening tomorrow," Katherine remarked as she handed him a steaming cup. "Having second thoughts?" Keegan asked, studying her face in the lamplight. "Not about opening the Queen of Hearts," Katherine replied, settling into one of the two chairs at her small table. "But I am thinking about what happens after." Keegan took the seat opposite her. "What do you mean?" Katherine traced the rim of her cup with one finger, organizing her thoughts. "You've been essential to making all this possible, Keegan, but the Patterson job is nearly finished. I know you don't typically stay in one place long." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Will you be moving on once the Queen of Hearts opens?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither had yet voiced aloud. Keegan set his cup down carefully. "I've been thinking about that myself," he admitted. "I've spent most of my adult life drifting from job to job, town to town. Never found a compelling reason to stay anywhere permanently." Katherine held her breath, waiting for him to continue. "But lately," he said, his voice growing softer, "I've been thinking that Sheridan might have something worth staying for." Their eyes met across the small table, and this time there was no interruption, no reason to look away or retreat to safer ground. "The Queen of Hearts will need someone to help manage security," Katherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone I can trust implicitly. A true partner." Keegan reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a deliberate echo of their moment at the bar earlier that day. "Is that a job offer, Miss Calloway?" Katherine turned her hand to intertwine their fingers. "It's more than that, Mr. Zavala, and I think you know it." The air between them seemed to still, the only sound their slightly quickened breathing and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere on the prairie beyond town. Keegan rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and gently drew Katherine to her feet. Standing face to face in the warm lamplight, they were finally acknowledging what had been building between them since that first night in Maybelle's saloon. "Katherine," Keegan said softly, one hand rising to lightly trace the curve of her cheek. "I've known my share of strong women in my life, my mother, women who survive and thrive in this harsh country, but I've never met anyone quite like you." Katherine leaned slightly into his touch, her composure giving way to the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "And I've never met anyone like you, Keegan. Someone who sees me as I am, not as what society expects me to be." The distance between them diminished until there was hardly space for breath. Keegan hesitated one final moment, giving her the chance to pull away if she wished. Instead, Katherine closed the remaining distance herself, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened as weeks of restrained feelings found their expression. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Keegan rested his forehead against hers. "I'll stay," he said simply. "For as long as you want me to." Katherine smiled, a rare, unguarded expression of pure happiness. "Then you'd better prepare for a very long stay, Mr. Zavala, because I don't see that changing anytime soon." They remained that way, standing close in the quiet apartment, both aware that they stood at the threshold of something new and precious, a partnership that had begun in the practical realm of business, but had grown into something far more meaningful. Tomorrow would bring the challenges of opening the Queen of Hearts, of facing Timothy Walsh's continued opposition, of establishing Katherine's place in Sheridan. But tonight, in this moment, there was only the two of them, no longer alone in their respective journeys. The grand opening of the Queen of Hearts was an unqualified success, despite Timothy Walsh's best efforts to undermine it. By 9 o'clock, the main room was filled to capacity, with more patrons waiting outside for the chance to enter. Katherine had dressed for the occasion in a striking emerald gown that complemented the establishment's decor, the silver Queen of Hearts pin prominently displayed at her collar. She moved through the room with gracious confidence, welcoming guests, explaining house rules, and occasionally taking a seat at one of the tables to deal a few hands herself, demonstrating both her skill and the fairness of the games offered. Keegan remained close by, his steady presence providing both security and moral support as Katherine navigated her first night as a business owner in Sheridan. To Walsh's evident dismay, many of Maybelle's regular patrons had come to sample the Queen of Hearts offerings, and most seemed impressed by the quality of the liquor, the honest games, and the atmosphere of civility Katherine insisted upon. Even more surprising to some was the presence of several respectable women from town, including Mrs. Ferguson and two of her friends, who sat at a table near the back enjoying modest glasses of sherry and watching the proceedings with evident enjoyment. "This is precisely what Sheridan has needed," Mrs. Ferguson declared loudly enough for most of the room to hear. "An establishment where a lady can enjoy an evening's entertainment without compromising her dignity." Katherine couldn't have scripted a better endorsement. As midnight approached, she took a moment to step outside for a breath of fresh air. The November night was cold but clear, stars scattered like diamond chips across the velvet sky above Sheridan. Keegan joined her a moment later, his breath forming clouds in the chilly air. "Quite a success in there," he observed, slipping an arm around her waist in a gesture that was becoming natural between them. "Better than I dared hope," Katherine agreed, leaning into his warmth. "Though I suspect Timothy Walsh is plotting his revenge even now." Keegan's arm tightened slightly. "Let him plot. The town has seen what you've created here, something honest and respectable that adds to Sheridan rather than diminishes it. Walsh can spread all the rumors he wants, but he can't change what people have experienced for themselves tonight." Katherine turned in the circle of his arm to face him, her expression serious despite the evening's triumph. "You know this is just the beginning. There will be challenges ahead from Walsh, from others who resent a woman succeeding in a man's world, from the very nature of business on the frontier." "I know," Keegan nodded, "and we'll face them together." He brushed a strand of blonde hair from her face with gentle fingers. "You're not alone anymore, Katherine. Whatever comes, you have a partner now." The word partner carried the same weight it had that first night, but now with added layers of meaning they both fully understood and embraced. Katherine reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw with tender appreciation. "The best partner I could have hoped for," she said softly, before rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his in a kiss that promised a future neither had imagined possible just weeks ago. Inside the Queen of Hearts, the grand opening continued in full swing, the beginning of what would become a Sheridan institution. Outside, in the quiet of the Wyoming night, Katherine Calloway and Keegan Zavala sealed their partnership in business and in life with a kiss that defied convention and embraced possibility. Two outsiders who had found in each other the belonging they had both been seeking. In the months that followed the opening of the Queen of Hearts, Sheridan witnessed the gradual but undeniable success of Katherine Calloway's venture. By spring of 1886, her establishment had become a fixture in town, drawing not only local patrons but travelers passing through on the nearby railroad who had heard about the unique gaming hall run by a capable, fair-minded woman. Timothy Walsh's attempts to undermine the Queen of Hearts continued for a time, spreading rumors, trying to intimidate suppliers, even hiring men to start trouble inside the establishment. But Katherine and Keegan proved more than equal to these challenges. Katherine's insistence on transparent, honest games and quality offerings gradually won over even some of Walsh's most loyal customers, while Keegan's quiet vigilance ensured that troublemakers were swiftly but fairly dealt with. By summer, Walsh had been forced to improve conditions at Maybelle's saloon, simply to remain competitive, ironically fulfilling Katherine's prediction that competition would benefit Sheridan as a whole. The town now boasted two successful establishments, each with its own character and clientele, though the Queen of Hearts was increasingly regarded as the more respectable option, particularly for visitors wanting to make a good impression. Throughout this period, Katherine and Keegan's personal relationship deepened alongside their business partnership. They maintained a measure of propriety for the sake of Katherine's reputation. Keegan kept his small cabin on the outskirts of town, though he spent most evenings at the Queen of Hearts and increasingly frequent nights in Katherine's apartment above the establishment. Those close to them, like Mrs. Ferguson and the small staff of the Queen of Hearts, understood the true nature of their relationship, but maintained a discreet silence on the matter out of respect and affection for both. On a warm evening in late August, Katherine stood at the window of her apartment, watching the sunset paint the distant Bighorn Mountains in shades of gold and purple. Below, on Sheridan's Main Street, townsfolk moved about their evening business, many of them now nodding respectfully to Katherine when they saw her, a far cry from the suspicious glances that had greeted her arrival nearly a year ago. She heard Keegan's familiar tread on the stairs before the door opened, and turned to greet him with a smile that still caused his heart to skip a beat, even after months together. "Busy night ahead," he remarked, crossing the room to place a gentle kiss on her lips. The cattle buyers from Cheyenne arrived on the afternoon train, Tom's already setting up the private room for their game. Katherine nodded, returning to her small vanity to put the finishing touches on her appearance for the evening. She still dressed elegantly for her role as proprietress, though she had gradually incorporated more practical elements into her wardrobe for the day-to-day management of the business. "I've been thinking," she said, watching Keegan's reflection in the mirror as he moved about the apartment with the easy familiarity of someone at home. "A dangerous pastime," he teased, earning a playful glare. "I'm serious, Keegan." She turned to face him directly. "This arrangement of ours, you maintaining your cabin while practically living here, it's becoming somewhat absurd, don't you think?" Keegan paused in the act of pouring himself a small whiskey, his expression growing more serious. "I've thought the same," he admitted. "But I didn't want to presume or to complicate your standing in town. You've worked hard for the respect you've earned." Katherine rose and crossed to him, taking the glass from his hand and setting it aside. "My standing in town is secure now. The Queen of Hearts is established, profitable, and respected, and as for presuming—" She took his hands in hers. "I think we're well past that point, don't you?" A slow smile spread across Keegan's face, warming his hazel eyes. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Calloway?" "I'm suggesting, Mr. Zavala, that it might be time to formalize our arrangement." She met his gaze steadily, her blue eyes clear and certain. "Unless you're still harboring thoughts of moving on someday," Keegan's hands tightened around hers. "You know better than that." "There's nothing that could make me leave Sheridan now, not when everything I want is right here." Katherine's smile softened with genuine emotion. "Then marry me, Keegan. Be my partner in every sense of the word, officially and permanently." For a moment, Keegan simply stared at her, before breaking into delighted laughter. "You know, most women wait for the man to do the asking." Katherine raised an eyebrow, her expression amused but determined. "When have I ever done things the conventional way? Besides, I believe in taking the initiative when something is important to me." Keegan sobered, his expression becoming tender as he reached out to trace the line of her cheek with gentle fingers. "And I am important to you. The most important," Katherine confirmed softly. "More than the Queen of Hearts, more than success or acceptance or anything I've sought in coming west. You are the unexpected gift I found in Sheridan, Keegan Zavala. The partner I never knew I was looking for until you stood up for me that night in Maybelle's." Keegan pulled her close, his arms encircling her waist. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Katherine Calloway, though I should warn you that marrying a half-Mexican cowboy might raise a few eyebrows even now." Katherine wound her arms around his neck, her expression resolute despite her smile. "Let them raise. We've faced worse opposition and prevailed. Besides, I suspect Sheridan has grown accustomed to us doing the unexpected by now." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed their agreement, a promise of the life they would build together, unconventional, challenging at times, but rich with the love and respect that had grown between them since that fateful first meeting. The wedding took place in October, almost exactly a year after Katherine's arrival in Sheridan. Mrs. Ferguson insisted they hold the ceremony in her garden, which was ablaze with autumn colors. The guest list included not only the staff of the Queen of Hearts and Mrs. Ferguson's wide circle of friends, but a surprising number of townsfolk who had come to respect the unlikely couple, even Mayor Hargrove, and two of the council members who had approved Katherine's business license, attended, their presence a public acknowledgement of her accepted place in the community. Katherine wore a simple but elegant gown of ivory silk, with Mrs. Ferguson's heart-shaped brooch pinned to her bodice alongside Keegan's silver Queen of Hearts. Keegan cut a handsome figure in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed but still falling to his collar in the style he preferred. They spoke their vows beneath an arch of golden aspen branches, their hands joined as they promised to walk through life as true partners, facing whatever challenges came their way together. The reception was held at the Queen of Hearts, temporarily transformed from a gaming establishment to a wedding venue with tables laden with food prepared by Mabel and decorated with autumn flowers. Music from a hastily assembled band of local musicians filled the air as guests celebrated with unrestrained enthusiasm. The union of the female gambling hall owner and the half-Mexican cowboy, somehow embodying the frontier spirit of reinvention and possibility that had drawn many of them west in the first place. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around Mrs. Ferguson's garden, Katherine and Keegan slipped away from the ongoing celebration to share a quiet moment alone. "Happy, Mrs. Zavala?" Keegan asked, his arm around her waist as they stood looking out at the lights of Sheridan spread below them. Katherine leaned into his embrace, savoring the newness of her married name. "Completely," she confirmed, "though I may still use Calloway for business purposes. The Queen of Hearts is rather established under that name." Keegan chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her where she pressed against his side. "Practical as always. One of the many reasons I love you." Katherine turned in his arms to face him, her expression serious despite her evident happiness. "When I came to Sheridan, I was looking for a place to establish my business, to prove I could succeed on my own terms. I never expected to find someone who would see past what others perceived as limitations, my gender, my unconventional occupation, and recognize me as an equal." "The town saw competition," Keegan acknowledged, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face with tender fingers. "I saw a woman of extraordinary courage and determination. How could I not admire that? How could I not fall in love with you?" Katherine reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong lines that had become so dear to her. "When you said you're my partner now that first night, I don't think either of us fully understood what that would come to mean. I think part of me knew even then, Keegan admitted, that you were someone who would change my life. I just didn't realize how completely. He pulled her closer. No more drifting, no more being an outsider. With you, I've found home, Katherine. Their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future, a future neither could have imagined when fate brought them together in a frontier town that had initially welcomed neither of them, but which had ultimately provided the setting for their unexpected love story. In the years that followed, the Queen of Hearts flourished under Katherine's capable management, with Keegan as her full partner in both business and life. They expanded the establishment to include a small restaurant that became known for serving the best meals in Sheridan, drawing families and respectable citizens who might never have entered a gaming hall otherwise. Timothy Walsh eventually sold Maybelle's saloon and left Sheridan when his business declined due to the superior competition, a vindication of Katherine's original vision. The building was purchased by a young entrepreneur who transformed it into a hotel, creating a more diversified Main Street that drew increasing numbers of visitors to the growing town. In the spring of 1888, Katherine gave birth to their first child, a son they named Michael, after Keegan's father. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Alina after Keegan's mother. The children grew up in the apartment above the Queen of Hearts, which had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, and later in a proper house, Keegan built on a small piece of land at the edge of town, with views of the mountains Katherine had come to love. The Queen of Hearts remained a Sheridan institution, eventually managed by Michael when he came of age, though Katherine maintained an active role in its operation well into her later years. It stood as a testament to what could be accomplished when convention was challenged, when partnerships were based on mutual respect and shared vision, when love found fertile ground in the unlikeliest of circumstances. And throughout Sheridan and beyond, the story was told of the determined woman who had defied expectations, the cowboy who had seen her worth when others saw only unwanted competition, and the words that had started it all. "You're my partner now." A partnership that had changed not only their lives, but the very fabric of the frontier town that had reluctantly, gradually, and finally wholeheartedly embraced them both.